It's amazing, isn't it, how cold cases, like mysteries stuck in time, can suddenly break open with new evidence or technology?
Yeah.
And today we're diving into one of those, the sweetheart murders.
Okay.
Happened back in 1980 in Davis, California.
Right.
Shook the community to its core.
Uh-huh.
We're going to be looking at a 48 hours episode all about it.
Okay.
It follows all the twists and turns
Yeah.
and how they finally, after more than 3 decades, solved it.
Wow, 3 decades is a long time. What's so interesting about this case is how it all started on what seemed like a normal evening.
Right.
College sweethearts, Sabrina Gonzalez and John Rigggins, were on their way to a surprise birthday party
Oh, wow.
for Sabrina's sister,
Okay.
December 20th, 1980.
Okay.
But they never made it.
And that's where the mystery starts, right?
Exactly.
Their families, they knew something was wrong.
Of course.
It was so unlike them to just disappear.
Right.
So they started searching frantically, and then their van was found abandoned.
Oh.
I can't even imagine that feeling of dread.
It must have been just awful. And then a few days later, the discovery of their bodies in a ravine outside of town. It just made everything worse.
Oh, gosh.
The crime scene, it was brutal. Duct tape, signs of a struggle. And tragically, their throats had been cut. This wasn't just a random crime. It felt personal. It really shook the community.
I can only imagine it must have been terrifying for everyone. Was this like a serial killer on the loose? Were other young people in danger?
Right, those are the big questions. The police must have felt so much pressure to find who did it.
For sure.
There were hundreds of tips coming in. They released a composite sketch. They even thought it might be a copycat crime.
Really?
They were looking into a connection with another double murder case involving a man named Gerald Gigo.
Okay.
But even with all that, the case went cold.
So for 9 years, nothing.
Nothing. It left a huge hole in the community.
Then 9 years later, there's this big twist.
Oh, yeah.
The police arrest a group of 4 people. They called them the Hunt Group.
The Hunt Group.
They thought they were involved in some plot to break Gerald Gigo out of prison.
Wow.
Investigators thought maybe the sweetheart murders were connected to all this.
Okay.
They charged David Hunt, his wife, and 2 other people who were with them.
So they thought this group was involved in both crimes.
That's what they thought at the time, and this is where DNA technology comes in. It was just starting to be used in the early 90s.
Right.
They tested a blanket that they found in the van, seemed like an insignificant piece of evidence.
Right.
The results were shocking.
What happened?
The DNA evidence completely cleared the entire Hunt Group.
Oh, wow. So not only were these people innocent,
Yeah.
but it meant the real killer was still out there somewhere.
Exactly. Maybe even living a normal life while the families of John and Sabrina were still grieving.
That's a tough pill to swallow. Must have been so frustrating for everyone involved, knowing the killer was still free.
Definitely a huge setback for the investigation. They basically had to start over from scratch.
So what happened next?
Well, it wasn't until 2002, with these national DNA databases, that things changed again.
Uh-huh.
The killer's profile finally got a match.
And it was
Richard Herschfield.
Richard Herschfield.
He was already in prison in Washington State for child molestation.
So the guy who did this horrible crime, he was already locked up for something else.
Chillin', right.
It makes you wonder, could this whole thing have been prevented? What if the justice system had handled his previous crimes differently?
It's a haunting thought. Maybe John and Sabrina would still be alive.
It makes you think about all those what-if scenarios in other cases, too. But at least in this case, they finally had their guy.
Right. So what did they do next?
Well, they had to connect the dots. They found out Herschfield had ties to Davis through an old friend. And guess what? His brother Joseph lived near that ravine where they found the bodies.
No way. That's too much of a coincidence.
Right. It seemed like a big lead.
So what did they find out from the brother?
They brought him in for questioning, and he was a nervous wreck.
I bet.
Especially when they started talking about the DNA evidence.
Hmm.
And then, shortly after that interview, Joseph took his own life.
Oh, no.
But he left a suicide note. And that note changed everything.
I did say.
He admitted to being there when the murders happened. And he pointed the finger right at his brother, Richard.
Wow. A confession.
He also wrote about how he'd been carrying the guilt for 20 years.
20 years. It just shows how much damage these crimes can do, how far the impact reaches. So they had the confession, but I'm guessing the case wasn't over yet.
No, not by a long shot. Getting Richard Herschfield to trial, that was a whole other battle.
So they're left with the suicide note
Right.
saying Richard Herschfield's the killer.
Yeah.
You'd think open and shut case.
Right.
But we know it doesn't always work that way, especially with the death penalty on the table.
You're right. The 48 Hours episode really gets into how complicated these cases can be.
Yeah.
It's not just about did he do it or not. There are so many legal procedures, motions and appeals. It can drag on forever.
Like years.
Years, decades even.
And in this case, a full decade. Herschfield's sitting in prison, but not for the sweetheart murders.
Right.
Can you imagine what the families went through, waiting all those years for justice?
It must have been agonizing.
The episode talks about how tough it was on everyone. Sabrina's father was even battling Alzheimer's during all this.
Oh, wow. Adding another layer of heartbreak on top of everything else.
That really emphasized how urgent it was to get this case moving.
Get some closure for the families before it was too late.
Exactly. And then finally, 2012, the trial starts.
Okay.
The prosecution, they had a really solid case. The DNA match connected Herschfield to the crime scene.
Right.
His brother's confession in the suicide note.
And then there was also testimony from the woman Herschfield had raped years before.
Yeah.
That really showed a disturbing pattern of behavior.
Absolutely. The episode mentions this chilling detail. During the rape, Herschfield asked the sisters, "Who wants to be raped?"
Oh, God.
It shows you the kind of cruelty he was capable of.
It wasn't just random violence. There was a real intent to terrorize.
Exactly. But the defense, they weren't going down without a fight.
Of course.
Tried to poke holes in the DNA evidence, said maybe it was contaminated or handled wrong.
They also tried to bring the Hunt group back into it.
Really? Even though they were proven innocent.
I guess they were trying every angle. In a death penalty case, the defense has to do everything they can.
Makes sense. They even brought in this guy, Gonzalez, a paid informant,
Wow.
said he'd overheard someone from the Hunt group confessing.
What?
But his story had problems. Lots of inconsistencies. He said he was drinking heavily that night, too.
So, not the most reliable witness.
Right. Even David Hunt, who was terminally ill at this point, just wanted it to be over. He wanted to see Herschfield pay for what he did.
That's really something. Someone who was wrongly accused, but still fighting for justice.
It says a lot about how deeply this case affected everyone. They all wanted the truth to come out. And in the middle of all the legal battles and the arguments, you can't forget about the families.
Right.
The 48 Hours episode shows them giving their statements during sentencing. It's heartbreaking. They talk about their pain, their anger, and how they've waited 32 years for justice.
The 32 years. Sometimes it feels like justice delayed is justice denied. Those families lived with so many unanswered questions.
So much grief and injustice. This trial wasn't just about guilt or innocence, it was about acknowledging all that suffering. So after 32 years, the families are finally in court, the jury's out, deciding John and Sabrina's fate.
Yeah.
They didn't take long, less than 3 hours, and they came back with a verdict.
I bet everyone was on the edge of their seats.
Guilty on both counts of murder.
Wow. 3 hours. You got to wonder what was going through their minds. Maybe it was just the evidence, all that DNA, the confession.
Could be. Or maybe it was the families, their testimony. Maybe they felt like they had to deliver justice after so much time.
Yeah, you're probably right.
This episode shows the moment they read the verdict, it's powerful, like there's this wave of relief, but it's mixed with so much sadness.
Yeah. Relief, but it's bittersweet.
Right.
They got justice, but it can't bring John and Sabrina back. And all those years they waited,
It's heartbreaking. Even the judge, before sentencing, he apologized to the families, said he was sorry for how long everything took.
Really?
Yeah, talked about all the waiting, the uncertainty. It's not every day you hear a judge admit that the system failed them.
It shows you the human cost of all this.
It really does. But beyond the emotions, this case also shows just how much DNA technology has changed things.
Definitely. Back in 1980, when this all happened, DNA evidence wasn't even a thing. Investigators had to rely on eyewitnesses, fingerprints, all the old methods.
Right.
But now with DNA, it's like a whole new world. Cold cases that were impossible to solve, now they have a chance.
Like this one. But it makes you think, what are the implications of all this DNA out there? How do we protect people's privacy?
Yeah, that's the big question. It's a powerful tool, but we got to use it responsibly.
For sure. And the sweetheart murders, they really highlight all these issues. But there's another takeaway here, too.
What's that?
The importance of not giving up. These investigators worked this case for over 30 years.
It's incredible.
Even when it seemed hopeless, they kept going. That kind of commitment, it's inspiring. They never gave up on finding the truth.
And in the end, justice was served.
It was. This deep dive, It's been a journey. We've talked about the horrors of murder, the legal system, the power of science, and how resilient people can be.
It really makes you think, how do we use this technology the right way? How do we prevent these things from happening again?
Yeah, those are the questions we need to keep asking. The fight for justice, it never really ends. And hopefully, by learning from cases like this, we can make the world a little bit safer, a little bit more just. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.